Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into the world of social psychology.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, you've given us this really interesting mix of stuff, YouTube videos, some pretty dense research papers, all about how we act when we're around other people, or even just, thinking about them.
It's amazing how much our social environment shapes us, isn't it?
Right. And that's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
Okay, so why should you care about social psychology? Think of it like a cheat sheet for how humans work.
I like that.
Ever wonder why you act so differently when you're in a group? Or how that ad on Instagram got you to buy that thing you totally didn't need?
Oh, yeah, those targeted ads are getting scary good.
They really are. And this deep dive will give you some answers and honestly, probably make you question some things you thought were just common sense.
It's always eye-opening to realize how much we're influenced by things we're not even aware of.
It really is. And that's where things get really interesting. What's fascinating about social psychology is that it's like a bridge between individual psychology, what makes you tick, and the larger social world we're all swimming in.
It's that sweet spot where your personality and the situation you're in, they kind of collide and create this unique behavior.
Exactly. And that's where the surprises start. We're going to uncover those invisible forces that shape how we interact with each other. And hopefully, you'll walk away understanding your own social life a little bit better.
I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Okay, before we go any further, though, we got to define what we're even talking about here. Gordon Allport, he was like a big name in social psychology. He called it, and I'm going to quote him here, the scientific attempt to understand how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by the real, imagined, or implied presence of other human beings.
Whoa. Even just imagining someone's watching us changes how we act. That's kind of creepy, but also makes total sense.
Right. Like, if you're walking down the street and you think someone's looking at you, you might straighten your posture or fix your hair. It's automatic.
Totally. And that word scientific is key, too. We're not just, speculating here. We're talking about real studies, experiments, hard data, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And a classic example of how this works is Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiment.
Oh, yeah, the one with the shocks. That's a wild one.
It really is. Okay, so picture this. You walk into a lab at Yale University. You think you're participating in a memory study, right? You and another participant. You think you draw straws to see who's going to be the teacher and who's going to be the learner.
Sounds innocent enough so far.
Yeah, right. But here's where things get really, really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The learner is actually an actor working with the researchers. You, the teacher, you get put in front of this scary looking shock generator. It's got all these switches going from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts.
Wait, they were shocking people.
Well, that's what the teacher thought. The shocks were fake, but the participant didn't know that. As the voltage goes up, the actor, the learner, starts screaming, begging to stop. The big question was, how far would people go just because someone in a lab coat told them to?
Okay, that's intense. Did people actually deliver those high voltage shocks?
The results are pretty disturbing, honestly. 65% of the teachers went all the way to 450 volts, even when the learner was pleading for mercy.
Wow. That's a lot higher than I would have guessed.
Right. And this wasn't about people being sadists or anything. It was about how easily we can be influenced by authority, even when we think what we're doing is hurting someone.
So it's under the right or, I guess, wrong circumstances, any of us could become the bad guy.
That's the unsettling implication, yeah. It really shows the power of the situation. And obedience is just one piece of the puzzle. Social psychology covers so much more, like how we perceive others, how groups influence us, even how all this plays out in real life, like in courtrooms or political campaigns.
So this isn't just about, weird experiments. It applies to how we understand the news, how we deal with our coworkers, all of that.
Absolutely. Let's take something as relevant as racial bias, for example. Studies using those shoot-don't-shoot simulations, where people have to decide super fast if someone's a threat, they show that implicit biases, those unconscious ones we're not even aware of, they can have a huge impact on those split-second life-or-death decisions.
Even if we think we're being objective, those biases can still creep in.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of how much we conform to what everyone else is doing. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments, they showed that people would rather give the wrong answer just because everyone else in the group is saying it.
Wait, seriously, even when the right answer is obvious?
Yep. It's the power of social influence. It can literally make us doubt what we see with our own eyes. And this applies to way more than just teenage peer pressure. Think about how easily misinformation spreads online.
Oh, yeah, good point. That's social influence in action, for sure.
It really is. And of course, social psychology also dives into our personal relationships. Research shows that men and women often look for different things in romantic partners, for example.
Which explains a lot of those classic relationship misunderstandings, right?
Totally. So we've got these big societal forces at play and the very personal dynamics of our one-on-one relationships all under this social psychology umbrella.
It's a pretty wide umbrella, it sounds like.
It really is. It's a huge field. And you might be thinking, how is this different from like sociology or clinical psychology? They definitely overlap. But social psychology has its own focus.
Okay, I'm curious. What's the difference?
So think of it this way. Sociology, it takes this wide-angle lens looking at whole societies and their structures, right?
Yeah.
Social psychology, it zooms in, it focuses on the individual within that society and how their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are shaped by that social context.
So it's kind of like micro versus macro.
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's go back to obedience for a second. A sociologist might study obedience by looking at the military, like analyzing its hierarchy, how it enforces following orders. A social psychologist would be more interested in setting up an experiment like Milgram's, trying to isolate those specific factors that make someone obey.
So both are interested in obedience, but they're asking different questions and using different methods to find answers. Makes sense. What about clinical psychology then? How is that different?
So clinical psychology is all about diagnosing and treating mental disorders. Social psychology, it's interested in how people typically think and act in social situations, even if those thoughts and actions are sometimes irrational or harmful.
So a clinical psychologist might work with someone who has, say, social anxiety, while a social psychologist might study why people experience that anxiety in the first place.
Exactly. Then there's personality psychology, which is focused on those stable traits that make you you. Are you shy, outgoing, agreeable? Social psychologists know personality matters, but they emphasize the power of the situation. The idea that the environment you're in can hugely impact how you behave, sometimes even overriding your personality.
Hold on. So even if I'm generally like a super chill person, I could turn into a total monster just because of the situation I'm in.
That's the power of the situation. It can really change us. And finally, we've got cognitive psychology, which studies mental processes like memory, attention, decision-making. Social psychology overlaps here by focusing on how those processes work in social situations, how we think about ourselves and others, and how those thoughts shape our interactions.
So it's not just what's going on in our heads, but how our thoughts mix with the social world around us.
Exactly. It's all connected. But you keep bringing up this power of the situation. Can you give me some real-life examples of how that works?
Oh, there are tons. One of the most dramatic ones is the Stanford prison experiment. Regular college students, they transformed into brutal guards or totally passive prisoners in just a few days, all because of the roles they were given and the environment they were put in.
That one's crazy. A fake prison turned those students into, like, real-life villains?
That's pretty scary. The experiment had to be stopped early because it got so out of control. It makes you think about how much our environment can really shape us, even if we think we're, like, inherently good people.
Like those old sayings, absolute power corrupts absolutely, or, you become who you hang out with. It's like social psychology backs those up with real research.
It really makes you think twice about those ideas. And the power of the situation isn't always about these huge transformations. Think about like how you do on a test when you're by yourself versus in a room full of other people.
Oh, yeah. I definitely get more nervous when I know I'm being watched.
Exactly. That's social facilitation at work. Or think about group projects, how some people slack off because they figure someone else will do the work.
Ugh, yeah. Classic social loafing.
Right. So even these seemingly small things in our environment can change how we act. Speaking of things that can influence us, you mentioned earlier that social psychology also looks at biases in our thinking, right?
Oh, yeah. Our brains are amazing, but they also take shortcuts. They make assumptions to help us process information quickly, and those can lead us astray. We call those cognitive biases. They're basically systematic errors in thinking that distort how we see the world and make judgments.
So they're like mental blind spots.
Perfect way to put it. A really common one is the fundamental attribution error. That's where we overemphasize someone's personality when we're trying to explain their behavior, but we totally ignore the situation they're in. Like, if someone cuts you off in traffic...
You immediately think they're a jerk.
Right, instead of considering maybe they're having a real emergency or something.
I'm definitely guilty of that. You think road rage is fueled by fundamental attribution error.
We all do it. It's this built-in bias, and it often comes with a buddy, the actor-observer bias. This one's where we flip the script when we're explaining our own behavior.
So we judge others more harshly than ourselves.
Yep. When we do something wrong, it's the situation's fault. I was late because of traffic. But when we succeed, it's all thanks to our awesome personality. I nailed that presentation because I'm just a natural.
Huh. It's like we all have these rose-colored glasses when it comes to ourselves.
Pretty much. That's called the self-serving bias, helps us keep a positive self-image. Then there's the hindsight bias, that I knew it all along feeling. Like when you predict the ending of a movie and then you act like you knew it the whole time, even though you were totally surprised 5 minutes ago.
Oh man, I do that all the time.
Me too. It's like a reflex.
Yeah.
Okay, so are these biases just annoying quirks, or do they actually affect our lives in any meaningful way?
They can have a huge impact on our relationships, our work, even our legal system. Think about how easily we can misjudge someone based on that fundamental attribution error, or how the self-serving bias can stop us from seeing our own faults.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like awareness is key, right? If we can understand these biases, we can catch ourselves when we're falling into these thought traps and try to be more objective.
Exactly. Social psychology isn't just about explaining why people do what they do. It's about giving us tools to think more critically about our own judgments.
It's like self-improvement through social psychology. I like that. Speaking of mind-bending stuff, one of the sources you gave me mentioned cognitive dissonance. What's that all about?
Cognitive dissonance, such a fascinating concept, developed by this guy, Leon Festinger. Basically, it's that uncomfortable feeling we get when our thoughts, beliefs, or actions don't line up with each other.
Okay, so if I say I'm all about saving the planet, but then I drive a gas-guzzling SUV, that would create cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. That mismatch between your values and your actions would probably cause some inner tension.
So what do we do about that tension? Do we just, suffer in silence?
Actually, we humans are really good at finding ways to reduce that dissonance. We might change our beliefs to fit our actions. So in your example, you might convince yourself that your SUV is pretty fuel efficient, or that you really need it for safety.
Or you could just, change your behavior, trade in the SUV for a hybrid.
Exactly. But sometimes we add new thoughts, basically finding excuses or rationalizations for our actions. So you might tell yourself, it's okay I drive this gas guzzler because I also recycle and compost.
So it's like we're all masters of self-deception, just to make ourselves feel better.
You could say that. Cognitive dissonance can be a powerful force for change, but it can also lead us to justify our bad habits. Think about smokers who keep smoking even though they know it's harmful. They might downplay the risks, focus on how much they enjoy it, or even tell themselves they'll quit soon.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how our minds try to maintain a sense of internal consistency, even if it's based on, really flimsy logic.
It's fascinating and kind of scary at the same time. This deep dive is really making me question everything I thought I knew about how people act. It's like I'm seeing the world through a new lens.
That's what social psychology does.
Yeah.
It gives us a framework to understand the complex relationship between what's going on inside our heads and the social world we live in. It provides insights into everything from why we conform to how we judge others.
And we're just getting started.
There's so much more to explore.
And remember, all this knowledge we're talking about, it isn't just about understanding other people, it's about understanding yourself.
Oh, yeah, that's where it gets really interesting.
Right, because once you kind of get a grasp on these forces that are working in your own social life, you can start to make different choices, more conscious ones.
So, if I tend to jump to conclusions about people, that fundamental attribution error thing we were talking about, I can try to, catch myself doing it and actually think about the situation before I judge.
Exactly. Or if you're aware of how much groups can influence us, you can be more careful about how your friends, your job, even those online groups you're in, how they might be shaping your opinions.
Like taking control instead of just going along with whatever everyone else is doing.
That's the goal. Social psychology can give you the tools to be a smarter, a more savvy social navigator. Whether you're dealing with tough people or a tricky situation at work, or just trying to figure out why people act the way they do.
I like that, a social navigator. Like you've got a map and compass for this crazy social world.
And the best part is, the map is always growing. The more you learn about social psychology, the more you learn about yourself and everyone else around you.
It's a lifelong journey.
It is. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Defining social psychology, those fascinating experiments, the biases we all have. What are some, like, key takeaways you want our listeners to really walk away with today?
Key takeaways. Okay, first and foremost, I'd say remember that we are all social creatures, like to our core. We're constantly influenced by the people and situations around us. Our behavior, it's not just about our personality, it's also about those social forces that are always working on us, whether we realize it or not.
It's not nature versus nurture. It's nature and nurture working together to shape who we are.
Exactly. And that means we have more power to change than we might think. If we can understand how these social factors influence us, we can start making different choices about how we think, how we feel, how we act.
So it's not about being like a puppet of your environment, but becoming aware of the strings and maybe even learning to pull a few yourself.
I love that analogy. And that brings me to another key takeaway. Be critical of your own thinking. We're all susceptible to those biases. But if we can become aware of them, we can challenge our own assumptions and try to be more objective in how we see things.
Which is, easier said than done. A lot of these biases, they're unconscious. How are we even supposed to know they're there?
Well, that's where all this research in social psychology comes in. By studying these biases, we can learn to recognize them in ourselves, and then we can develop strategies to, minimize their impact.
It's like having a therapist for your mind, helping you identify and work through those mental blind spots.
That's a great way to put it. And just like therapy, it's an ongoing thing. There's always more to learn about ourselves and how we fit into this social world.
So much to learn. This deep dive has already been so eye-opening. I feel like I'm learning so much about human nature, about how we connect with each other, and even how we disconnect sometimes.
And we're just scratching the surface. Social psychology is this huge, fascinating field. There's so much more to explore.
Okay, so we've talked about the what of social psychology, the definition, the main areas it studies, those biases. What about the why? Why should people listening to this care? How does it apply to our everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because social psychology, it's not just some abstract academic thing. It's about understanding the forces that are literally shaping our world, from our personal relationships to global politics.
So it's not just about, why your roommate leaves dirty dishes in the sink, but also, why conflicts happen, why people discriminate against each other, why some social movements take off and others don't.
Exactly. Social psychology helps us analyze all those things. It gives us insights into the motivations, perceptions, those influences that drive human behavior on a massive scale.
So if I understand social psychology better, I can be, a more informed person, a better communicator, more understanding and empathetic towards other people?
All of the above. It can help you navigate those tricky social situations, make better decisions, and even become a more effective advocate for change.
I'm convinced. Social psychology is officially my new obsession. Are there any, books, websites, podcasts you'd recommend to our listeners who want to dive deeper?
Oh, tons. For a really solid overview, I'd recommend Social Psychology by David Myers. It's a classic textbook, but it's actually really interesting to read.
Oh, yeah. I love David Myers. He's a great writer.
He really is. If you want something shorter, focused on specific topics, The Social Animal by Elliot Aronson is amazing. He uses all these real-world examples to explain things.
Perfect. I'm adding that to my reading list. What about online stuff? Any websites or blogs you find helpful?
Absolutely. The website for the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, SPSP, is a goldmine. You can stay updated on all the latest research, news, all that.
And for our podcast fans, are there any other podcasts that you like that cover social psychology?
Well, you're already listening to one of the best, The Deep Dive, obviously. But for one specifically about social psych, I'd say Hidden Brain is fantastic. It digs into those unconscious patterns in human behavior using research from psych, sociology, even neuroscience.
Oh, Hidden Brain is so good. Super thought-provoking. Speaking of thought-provoking, are there any movies or TV shows that do a good job of showing social psychology principles in action?
Ooh, that's a fun question. 12 Angry Men, that old movie, it's a classic for a reason. It shows how conformity works, group dynamics, persuasion, all that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It's amazing how a movie from, the 50s can still be so relevant today.
Right. And for a modern example, Black Mirror, that show often looks at the darker side of technology, how it affects our relationships and interactions. It raises some really interesting questions about things like social isolation, online identity, even the ethics of AI.
Black Mirror is definitely a mind trip, makes you think about the world in a whole new way.
Exactly. And that's what social psychology should do. Encourage us to question our assumptions, challenge our biases, and really dig deep into the complexity of human behavior.
So it's not just about understanding what we do, but also why we do it and how we can use that knowledge to make the world a little bit better.
Precisely. Social psychology gives us the tools to be more aware, more empathetic, more empowered in how we interact with each other, both personally and on a bigger scale.
Well said. This deep dive has been truly eye-opening. Like, I've got a whole new toolkit for navigating the social world now.
And remember, it's a journey. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning. The world of social psychology is always changing and growing, so there's always something new to discover.
Okay, so we've established social psychology is important, fascinating, and can help us understand, like, pretty much everything about how people act. But before we move on, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier, that power of the situation.
Ah, yes. That's one of the most important and maybe the most unsettling ideas in social psychology, isn't it? It makes us question how much control we actually have over our own lives.
It really does. Makes you wonder, are we just puppets of our environment reacting to whatever happens around us?
That's a big question. Philosophers and psychologists have been debating that for ages. And social psychology doesn't give easy answers. But it does show us how those situational factors can influence our choices in ways we don't even realize a lot of the time.
So even though we think we're being rational, making our own decisions, the reality is we're constantly being shaped by everything around us.
Exactly. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. This power of this situation, it can be used for good, too, not just bad.
Can you give me an example?
Well, think about social norms. Those unwritten rules we all follow, depending on where we are, who we're with. They influence how we dress, how we talk to each other, so many things. And they can be a powerful tool for making positive change.
So if we can create social norms that encourage, like kindness, empathy, working together, that can actually change how people behave.
Absolutely. Look at the movement to reduce plastic. Activists have raised awareness of the environmental impact. They've promoted reusable stuff, and it's created a new norm. Now, way more people are using less plastic.
That's really cool. It shows how understanding this stuff, this social psychology, can actually help us make the world better.
Kind of inspiring, right? Like it shows we're not just, stuck with whatever situation we're in.
Yeah.
We can actually change things.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of stuff today. The definition of social psychology, those experiments, all the biases we have to watch out for. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final question, something to really think about.
Ooh, I love a good brain teaser.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so we've been saying how much situations can influence us, right? But at what point does that influence override our own sense of what's right and wrong? Is there a line where we say, nope, I'm not doing that, even if it means going against everyone else?
That is a really good question. And honestly, it's one that social psychology is still figuring out.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of, what does it even mean to be human? How do we balance our own morals with all that pressure from society? It makes you think about those times in history when people had to choose between just going along with the crowd and doing what they believed was right. What makes someone stand up and say no when everyone else is saying yes?
It takes a lot of courage, that's for sure. It's about taking responsibility, knowing that you have a choice. Even when it feels like you have to do something, you can always resist.
That's a really powerful idea. So it's not just about understanding why people do bad things. It's also about understanding how good people can end up doing bad things and how we can try to make better choices.
Exactly. Because every single one of us is capable of both good and bad. The important thing is to be aware of what's influencing us, both inside ourselves and out in the world, and use that knowledge to make good choices.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this.
It's been fun. I always love geeking out about social psychology with people who are curious about it.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of social psychology. Remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep learning about the forces that shape our social world.
Because the more we understand about ourselves and each other, the better we can make this world a little bit kinder, a little bit more just.
I love that. Okay, that's a wrap for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a whole new topic.